So Christopher Jane Miller, the co-founder and vice president of academic affairs at Arihanta Institute, completed his PhD in the study of religion at the University of California, Davis. He is a visiting researcher at the University of Zurich's Asian Orient Institute and visiting professor at Claremont School of Theology. Christopher's primary fields of research interest are yoga studies and Jain studies, and he's the co-editors of Engaged Jainism, who will be out in 2025, and he's the author of Embodying Transnational Yoga, Eating, Singing, and Breathing in Transformation, which is the book we are going to discuss today, together with Jonathan Dickstein. And Jonathan is an assistant professor of Jain Studies at Arihanta Institute and visiting assistant professor at Religion at Claremont School of Theology. So Jonathan specializes in South Asian religions, religion and animals, and comparative ethics. He received his doctoral degree in religious studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and his master's degree in religious studies from the University of Colorado, Boulder. He has published in a wide array of interdisciplinary journals, and his current work focuses on Jainism and contemporary ecological issues, extending into critical animal studies, food studies, and diaspora studies. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I am extremely happy to be here. I can't tell, is my video okay right now, or is it lagging a little bit?
No, your video is fine.
Yeah. Okay, great. And I'm really happy to introduce this book by Professor Miller. So I'm going to jump right in here. Embodying Transnational Yoga, Eating, Singing, and Breathing in Transformation is an ethnographic journey into modern yoga modalities that escape most mainstream conceptions of yoga practice. One will be sorely disappointed if they pick up Miller's text expecting protracted discussions of postural practices and how postures are supplemented with additional practices of eating, singing, and breathing. Rather, Miller foregrounds the primacy of these less studied forms of practice within transnational yoga, or what he terms engaged alchemies, at 3 different field sites: Yogananda in Amityville, New York, Polestar Gardens on the Big Island of Hawaii, and Kaivalya Dhamma in Lonavala, Maharashtra. At Yogananda Ashram, vegetarianism and the yogic diet interface with the counter-cuisine movement of the 1970s. At Polestar Gardens, the ukulele joins the kirtan ensemble in a curious but also quite consistent manner, echoing a kindred history of the harmonium. And finally, at Kaivalya Dhamma, purifying yogic breathing practices address, combat, and somehow also escape the incontrovertible impurity of the Mumbai breathscape. At all 3 sites, both past and present knowledge production dissemination is far from linear. Miller encounters the westernization of allegedly pure Eastern thought systems and somato-spiritual regimens, but much more prominent are the dynamic ecologies of personal, social, political, and economic forces that contribute to philosophical and practical adjustments in both disseminators and community members' practices. Miller makes it explicitly clear in his introduction that his work is indebted to De Michaelis, who expertly highlighted how modern postural yoga largely emerged and developed in a westernized temporal, cultural, and scientific context. And Miller applies this heuristic uniquely to other practices of yoga. Yet Miller's text also highlights how exchange is a multi-way street, most notably within Indian elements of yoga, also succeeding in, to quote Joseph Alter, colonizing the West. Thinking with yoga scholars such as Anya Foxon and Krista Kubari, who chart yoga's interaction into and even overwriting onto extant, quote, Western forms of practice, end quote, and with anthropologist Anat Singh's concept of frictions to describe transnational cultural exchange, Miller both pays tribute to De Michaelis's A History of Modern Yoga and buds his own yoga studies branch to expand the vision and discourse of the field in the 21st century. So I'd like to begin by kind of offering a basic general question about the text itself and its place. So first, Professor Miller, can you describe the space that embodying transnational yoga occupies in the constellation of modern yoga studies texts of the last 2 decades, starting with De Michaelis's book? What are some similarities and differences with the other fields in the text?
Well, thank you so much for reading and reviewing the book, Jonathan, and also to Lucy and Daniela for having me here. It's actually quite excited to receive an invitation to participate in this wonderful event because my work is so indebted to the work of Elizabeth de Michaelis. So if you read the introduction to my book, which is available online for free, if anybody wants to download it, you can see that I'm really engaging with de Michaelis's work as closely as possible with regard to the way that I develop my methodology for this book. So I remember reading a history of modern yoga on an airplane, as many graduate students do when they're on the way to a conference or something like that. And I remember being so excited and taking so many notes and writing things down. And one of the things I noted in there was this, what is also a well-known botanical metaphor of yoga being a tree, the tree of modern yoga. And there's a branch of modern yoga, and it's the youngest branch in the tree of yoga, as we are told, right? And another thing I noted in that book, and I think it speaks to what Elizabeth de Michaelis talked about yesterday, which was that there were these echoes, as she said yesterday, echoes of yoga in this Western practice. And what I kind of really felt from my own experience of practicing in different communities of yoga, both postural and or not postural, was that those echoes were actually, for me, the core part of the experience. And so I wanted to write a book that took into account those other parts of yoga that I saw perhaps not being taken into account in postural yoga scholarship, in scholarship that covered postural yoga. Now, I'm a big fan of postural yoga. I practice postural yoga. But one of the things that really stood out to me in the book, one of the quotes that I quoted was that this yoga had evolved mainly through the interaction of Western individuals interested in Indian religions and a number of more or less westernized Indians over the past 150 years. And sort of what I'm trying to set up in this book as a leaping point is that there were a lot of also Indian individuals who are interested in Western religions and culture who are actually Indianizing Westerners, as I had felt I had been in my own experience studying under various yoga traditions that were not primarily posturally based and that involved the practices of eating, singing, and breathing. And so what I'm trying to do here is maybe show the other side of transmission, the reception of these Western categories by gurus, but also how gurus saw in the Western categories of practice of eating, singing, and breathing in various parts of the world, how they were able to simultaneously harness those practices to create a transformative system of their own that they still considered yoga, and that involved these three practices in various ways. One of the great inspirations I also took from the work of de Michaelis, and I thought Daniela did a wonderful job doing a literature review yesterday, so I won't do the whole literature review of modern yoga. I really felt like that was spot on. But one of the things that came out of de Michaelis's work, I think it was an article I read in 2008, as well as the work of Suzanne Newcomb during that time, was this call for more better anthropological methods and ethnographic methods to be able to study modern yoga in a better way. And I took that call, and I was really inspired by her book, by the work of Suzanne Newcomb in that wonderful literature review that was online for a really long time, that many of us got to see kind of a glimpse in 2009 of what the field looked like. And then there was another book that was published during that time, and that was the book of Joseph Alter, of course, in 2004, Yoga in Modern India, that we talked about yesterday. And what I saw in Alter's work, and what Professor Dickstein just mentioned, was this notion that on the one hand, yes, yoga was reshaped during the colonial period in significant ways. And on the other hand, there was also another transmission kind of going back from the periphery to the metropole, if we want to put it that way, in kind of anthropological terms, going back into Western culture, which made it possible for yoga to colonize the West. And what was that? So, of course, Alter is writing about Swami Kuvalayananda, and the way he used science to show the more subtle dimensions and promises of samadhi and these other aspects of yoga that Indian yoga disseminators just took for granted. And in my work, I really wanted to show that other transmission coming the other way, in the way that they understood what they were doing was, yes, fully colonized in these categories of science, new thought, physical culture, and all the wonderful things we've heard about and read about during this conference as well as in the field. I wanted to show how at the same time they were using those very same practices to accomplish what they saw as yogic goals in various ways. And the last thing I'll say about this is that a lot of botanical metaphors have been used by scholars of modern yoga to describe the way that yoga has developed and evolved, right? So we have this tree metaphor in Dave Michaelis's work, and then we have in Beatrix Hauser, we have this notion that it's like a banyan tree, and this gets taken up by Krista Kuberry and Anya Foxen as describing yoga as rhizomatic in its development. There's no core or center. There's many messy things all coming together to create this thing we call yoga all over the world. And so the job of the scholar, and the way I saw it, is I wanted to show what is coming together at 3 particular field sites to create these yogas, both from the more predominant, what we would consider Western culture, and also the way that the Indian purveyors were bringing something unique in. And from those encounters, new yoga systems were created that somehow maintained something of their, I don't want to call it essence, but of their roots in India, we'll call it that, and also simultaneously was connecting and turning into something new as it came together in other contexts at my field sites.
Wow, that's super interesting and a really like wonderful kind of broad sketch of the work and who and which text you're engaging with. And you start to mention these rhizomatic approach, the banyan tree metaphor. So I suppose I'd like to ask maybe a more technical question about terminology in the text itself, right? You use these very innovative terms such as engaged alchemies, frictions, engaged universals. And I'm really curious to hear kind of where these terms come from, and then also how they translate specifically into your ethnographical work, and how you think they actually add to the conversation in this respect.
Yeah, so at UC Davis, where I was in the graduate group for the study of religion, I was also in a group called the Reimagining Indian Ocean Worlds cohort, which was an interdisciplinary group of scholars from ethnomusicology, I mean, anthropology, any field you can think of, food studies. We were all there together studying things happening in the Indian Ocean. And one of the things we read was Anna Singh's book, Frictions, in which she describes when any universal, cultural universal, science, whatever, but yoga in this case, travels into a new place, it experiences frictions when it enters that new cultural terrain. And as a result, both things are transformed, right? The yoga will change from the friction, and the cultural terrain, the new cultural terrain will also be changed. And so what I'm trying to do in this book is show how these yogic universals, as they travel across cultural spaces, are experiencing friction. It's not always as easy as the banyan tree kind of growing together into another tree. There are also difficulties. There are frictions and flows, let's say, that make things possible in each of these field sites. And that's where I'm getting these terms from. So an engaged universal is a universal yoga that travels across, becomes engaged in a new cultural terrain, and is changed, but also simultaneously changes the cultural terrain at the same time.
Thank you for that. And it actually reminds me, in animal studies, an Australian scholar, Dinesh Wadiwal, talks about conflict zones, areas in which things interact, and they're not just contact zones. He's kind of leaning on Haraway here, and that sometimes this isn't just this exchange of ideas that are just intermingling and producing something new, but there's actually friction, there's conflict. And so I'd kind of like to use this background, maybe even of conflict or of challenge, to bring up another question. We're good on time for one more question or 2 more questions?
Of course.
Okay. So your book does a remarkable job of filling in the histories of the main figures of yoga you feature, who are historically located, such as in colonized Hawaii and pollution-clouded Mumbai. And these sites emerge as main characters in their own rights. Or at least as I read the text, it really feels like we're not just talking about the human agents, but actually the sites themselves. And through these site histories, you foreground prevalent socioeconomic phenomena such as globalization, neoliberalism, necropolitics, and the environmental impacts of industrial capitalism. So can you talk? I mean, I really think this is a very, if not unique, but less common feature of your text, which is are these robust situational framings of where yoga practice, also non-postural yoga practices, are taking place. I mean, postural yoga practices are also taking place, but that's not your area of study. But can you really talk about how important it was for you to give these robust situational framings as I'm describing them?
Yes, and perhaps a few concrete examples here now from the chapters will also help illustrate what I mean by all of these theoretical terms and things we're talking about here. So I came into the study of yoga through yoga texts. I thought I was going to be a Sanskritist. I thought I was going to be a philologist. Well, it didn't work out that way. We can talk about more why later. But I ended up studying with people who study various forms of culture, as I mentioned before, in that interdisciplinary group. And what that really led me to do is to pay very careful attention to context. And so what I'm really doing here is paying very close attention to where that yoga texts, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, Hatha Yoga Pradipika, Bhagavad Gita, all the popular texts canonized in the crucible of colonialism. I'm paying attention to how those texts are being reinterpreted in very specific places. And as I dug into those places ethnographically and from a social historical perspective, I started to learn so much. I heard Elizabeth De Michaelis talking about yesterday how you get kind of lost in this and it causes all kinds of problems because you're just so immersed in the research, right? And I really, for example, when I was looking at the first field site, which was Granny Anjali's Yoga Anandashram during the American counterculture, she was promoting vegetarianism and had a vegetarian restaurant as one of the primary ways to implicate oneself in her eightfold yoga system. Now, of course, she's promoting vegetarianism. That's not a big surprise, right? But what she's trying to do is lead students to an experience of Kaivalya. And so if we ever want to know how Sankhya yoga comes into new territory, here's a great example. She's trying to give students an experience of Kaivalya, of the kind of isolation or freedom of their consciousness, of Purusha. That's all fine and well, right? We can find that and we can read about that in the Yoga Sutra. She's teaching it from various texts at the time. And then at the same time, the question becomes, where is she getting those practices from? Where is she getting her vegetarian food? Where are they eating? What are they serving? And there's a much broader counter cuisine hip enterprise movement that's happening all over America at the time, where vegetarianism and all the practices of this romance of service, of being available to others to liberate one's consciousness more broadly, having nothing to do with yoga, is already taking place. And so what I really see Anjali doing here, as I describe in thick detail, this counter cuisine movement that's separate from this yoga movement that she has going on, are coming together, and she's finding an opportunity there for her students to be able to practice ahimsa in order to achieve kaivalya. But for her countercultural students, it very much resonates with broader things that are going on in the counterculture about raising and experiencing one's consciousness, eating to do what's right, to do the right thing. The personal is political. All these kinds of ideas are there, but there's an overlap in like the Venn diagram between this counter cuisine movement and Anjali's practices of yoga that make a kind of perfect fit. So she's able to teach her yoga, and her students are allowed to have their counter cuisine, so to speak. And it shows also the racial, the gender demographics of who's involved in that movement more broadly. It helps us understand all these very thick and rich social categories. So that's just one example.
Thank you for that. I have one more question before maybe, or where are we at? It's up to
you go, Jonathan. I've got a question for Chris, but you go first and I'll jump in after you. And then if anyone else has a question, please put them in the chat.
All right, so lastly, the field of yoga studies seems to me at least largely divided divided's not the right term, but say bifurcated between textualists and ethnographers. You are an ethnographer studying social worlds where texts are one of the main features. And in this book, you participate yourself in many of the practices you study, which are themselves drawn from popular yoga texts. So can you describe the benefits and challenges of this approach? Maybe not ethnography per se, but also your personal involvement. Just as a side note, yes, I could, especially just reflecting on De Michaelis's text and coming from a long background in Iyengar yoga myself, I could just only imagine the challenges, say, of participating in that and also kind of describing the world around it. So just kind of personally, what do you find to be some of the benefits and challenges there?
Yeah, I think Shamim talked about this too, that, and I agree with what Shamim was saying, that I came to this out of a personal interest as a practitioner before I was a scholar, right? So I started studying yoga texts like many people do. I was practicing in postural yoga studios, but also training in yoga teacher trainings where posture was a very subordinate thing. And so once again, I came into it with this idea that I was going to unlock the secrets of these Sanskrit texts, and I was going to go to grad school and I was going to translate them and learn Sanskrit and do all these things. And there's certainly something to that, right? But as karma or fate or whatever you want to say had it, the person who was going to be my advisor did not get tenure, and that person was interested in maybe doing some of these things with me. And so that really forced me into this more critical approach. And at the same time that happened, I actually had one of the books here with me. But Richard Davis had written his book, The Bhagavad Gita, a biography. David Gordon White had written his book, Patanjali, a biography. And what I saw here was an amazing opportunity. And what I try to do in this book in other ways is show how these texts and others are entering into particular fields of practice. And as I'm experiencing them as well, and I write about this a bit in the foreword of the book, how they're playing out in a very real world where it's extremely messy. And so it was very difficult for me. And on the other hand, I was also having to draw from a lot of secondary scholarship from the people who we all know and who are here, James Mallinson, also the work of Vilke and Moibus, others who have written about the topics I'm writing about from Sanskrit texts and the texts that I'm looking at. And I was really kind of heavily relying on secondary scholarship to help explain some of the background of where these texts come from. And so what I try to do in this book is bring a lot of that scholarship in to help tell the story of how these texts even came into the hands of the folks that are using them and the gurus who are disseminating them, but then also try to show it ethnographically, like this is what happens when the rubber meets the road, when the text becomes embodied, so to speak.
Thank you. And so, yeah, I'll pass it over to Lucy or Daniela, whoever had that question first, at least.
Well, I think we've both got questions, but I'm going to jump in first. So I was interested about what you were saying in terms of the movement of these practices transnationally, and that there's not just flow, but there's also friction. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit with maybe some examples that you'd come across.
Yeah, absolutely. So when Gurani Anjali, and I can go through the chapters maybe a little bit, when Gurani Anjali comes to Long Island, New York, where she's located, where the Yoga Anand Ashram is founded, she's promoting vegetarianism, right? But the vegetarianism that she had from India, the food, the actual food and where it was coming from was very different from what she would encounter when she would come to the US, right? So first of all, from a practical perspective, she had to find the opportunity in the social system that she was in to be able to disseminate those practices in a way that made sense. And so there's like this food ideology from yoga text coming over into a new social framework, and it is found. She finds the vegetarianism there, the opportunities there, but it's in this countercultural movement. And this countercultural movement, this counter cuisine movement, is happening separately on its own, when she's there. But when her system encounters that, it changes the counter cuisine and people who are practicing in the counter cuisine itself, right? So her students, so to speak, their counter cuisine kind of culture is simultaneously changed by the frictions between her yogic practice and ideology and the counter cuisine itself. So the counter cuisine changes, but so too do the practitioners from a yogic perspective, because they're using that and harnessing that as a bigger part of this transformative yoga system, if that makes sense. There's also the example from Hawaii. So in Hawaii, what happens is you have Yogananda's Kriya Yoga system, which he's bringing from Bengal, right? He brings to the United States. He's in Los Angeles, and he brings with him a universal practice of listening for the unstruck sound within, which many of us will be familiar with, and we heard about it. Anahata Nada, listening for the unstruck sound within, Nada Anusandana, right? So that's a part of his Kriya Yoga system. And that system really requires any kind of music to work, following the 13th century musicology from which he's at least in many ways connected or has a sensibility with. And so when that 13th century musicology comes over and says, you need music as the starting point for your meditation, he doesn't come and play music that he's accustomed to hearing in India. He comes and he lets Christians sing songs that are familiar to them. Now, eventually he uses that as an opportunity to get them to sing other songs in Sanskrit and whatnot, or chant kirtan songs. But the initial kind of friction between his musicology and the American musical landscape, let's just say, creates something new, right? So the yoga is still there, but it's very much transformed and becomes part of, and also encounters frictions with this US based musical system or set of cultures, let's just say. And then it goes to Hawaii and the ukulele enters in. So there's like more frictions between tropical paradise and this sounds of tropical paradise and Kriya Yoga. And somehow the practitioners still think this is Kriya Yoga. So they're kind of creating a new form of Kriya Yoga that nevertheless maintains a commitment to the fundamental underlying principles of the Kriya Yoga. Thanks, Lucy.
Then I will jump because my question is related to the Hawaii situation. And so to the pole stars activities, because if I understood properly, music is a part, and this sharing, participating in a very communal activities. But in that chapter, there are also people who actually are not participating enough, right? So did you have the time to talk to them and understand why they were not as active as the others? Because it seems that after a while they were put a bit on a side. They were not that not devotees, but they were not doing the practice properly, it seems, right? So they were a bit put aside. So did you talk to them?
Yes. So it was a very big mix of people, and this is where it became very social. I interviewed, talked to people in the community. In Polestar itself, you have like a very core community of people who are committed, let's say, live there full time, work there full time, and are really like the ones, generally speaking, who are fully engaged in practicing Kriya Yoga. Most of them are actually initiated into Kriya Yoga because it's the initiatory system. And then you had people who would come and visit, like me, and others who would come to participate in their Karma Yoga program, stay for a month, stay for 3 months, stay for 6 months, whatever, as a sabbatical or something like this to practice and learn yoga. And there it would be a variety of experiences. And I explained a little bit of it in the book about people having different experiences of Kundalini, and the way they described it was different. And a lot of what I think the issue was that people came with various dispositions and personalities, and there were certain personalities who would really get into the meditation and stick around and stay for a long time, and there are others who just were kind of like, I don't understand what's happening, I don't get it. And it was a constant tension in the community between trying to get people to participate and with those people who were always like very core committed and participating. The main thing they would always say is meditation. And so talking to those people, it was usually that like meditation wasn't work for them. I can't meditate. They just got tired of it. They couldn't sit still with their thoughts for so long. I mean, many of the common reasons that people struggle with meditation. But there was like a core, both within the community and living around the community, group of people who, I mean, literally their discipline was just unwavering and would meditate 3 times a day. And I did that with them while I was there because I really wanted to be with them. But I also understood and I listened to these other voices that, would kind of veer off the track or would just kind of say, okay, I'm ready to go home. So yeah, common experience, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's the best part of the field work, when the social and the human connection. And I have another question on Anjali, because it's like it's a very interesting figure, I would say. So can you describe a bit the relationship that students had with her? Like, was she a kind of guru ma, in the sense of, did the student become devotees of her, or she remained a kind of lay person in their imagination?
No, she was very much Guru Ma, very much the guru, for sure. And she called herself Gurani. coming from Bengal, and she would use the kind of feminized version of that. And she I think she saw herself as, and the students saw her as a guru, like and I quoted Philip de Slip's work to kind of say that, and Shamim talked to this, how there were these varying approaches to people from India at this time, post 1965, when the gurus are coming in from all around the world, or from South Asia, and a lot of people are coming from all over the world into the United States, that there were either opportunities that could be harnessed for becoming a guru, or you could really be hated, depending who you were. So you had to be careful. In the Yogananda chapter, I show how Yogananda, of course, was up against a lot of racism, particularly in the South. And then when we get to Gurani Anjali, she actually has this opportunity. And I quoted a couple of instances in the chapter where students, so like white countercultural students, men and women, would come up to her when they saw her in her sari, because she always wore a sari around Long Island, New York. And they would say, are you from India? This is one of the quotes from one of the students. Are you from India? Can you teach me yoga? So she fell into more of that realm of fascination, that kind of Orientalist fascination, where you have these white counterculturalists, again, part of this counter cuisine thing that's already happening, aimed at social justice and all this stuff. And then they see this yoga guru, and not just a yoga guru, but a woman, a South Asian woman, who ends up, she had her own yoga training. It wasn't that she didn't know yoga. She very much knew and practiced yoga, but she saw an opportunity. And I think I try to tease this out in the chapter, where if students are asking me to teach them yoga, she's seeing Richard Hittleman on TV teaching yoga. She was like, wow, oh, I can do that. And she really capitalized on her social and historical moment to really become a guru, as you say. Like people saw her as that, and they did a lot for her as a form of like karma yoga, in terms of running the ashram, running the restaurant, and all the things that had to be done. So
the money of the restaurant, let's say, being very pragmatic, we're going into the ashram. I mean, how big is this ashram? How many people are involved in these activities? I mean, it add like some income also going to Guruma, or is just for maintaining the ashram and the restaurant?
We'd have to look at the, I asked this question, it was hard to get an answer to this question, but we have to look maybe at the non, because it was a nonprofit, 501c3, look at their Form 990 and see, where was the money going. But in general, like, I know that like the cooks were being paid, and they were running it very much like a nonprofit business. They weren't making a ton of money. And she was also trained in nursing, so was working as well. So she did a lot of things. She became eventually the director of the ashram, but it wasn't huge. And that was one of the things I really liked about it, is it wasn't one of these huge transnational gurus that we're dealing with here. It was someone who was really like trying to make a life, who had kids and a family, was also married in Long Island. And, the membership, I would guess, was somewhere between 50 and 100 people, maybe max. There's some people just like at in Hawaii, where they were there, they weren't always participating, but then there was a core group of students they called them pillars, who were very committed, who were always there, and were really the ones who were managing and running the day-to-day things. I don't know to the extent to which how much income she actually received from the ashram, but if any, I think it would be modest, because it was really small, very local operation. I mean, primarily the restaurant business, they had a bookshop, some of these other things in town, but it was a nonprofit, so it wasn't this major money-making enterprise.
Okay, so she didn't want to create an enterprise of Anjali, like spread in the world, basically.
That's right. Yeah, she was very, very local, and in my reading of her work, very humble, and kind of accepting the role and the opportunity that was there on Long Island at the time. So I never saw like, I know she was in touch with like Satchitananda. She knew Satchitananda, for example. She knew some of the other gurus that we're familiar with from the time, but she didn't, I don't think, ever aspire to be, as far as my reading of her work, like one of these great gurus or guranis, so to speak. And I think that it's very charming for me, like the story of how kind of really local this movement was. And at the same time, when you talk to the practitioners and read her works, how she understood herself to be translating Patanjali's Yoga Sutra on Long Island, through this broader vegetarian movement.
Yeah, it's great.
Going to cut in, Daniela, because we're running short and Elizabeth has a question. So if we could bring Elizabeth in, that would be lovely.
Yeah, hi, hello to you. Christopher, thanks very much for your acknowledgements of my book. It's so great to hear that it has been useful to people. I had a quick question about, I don't think you engaged in that. I only, very quickly yesterday downloaded the PDF of the introduction of your book, which I look forward to reading eventually. So I only have a kind of a rough idea. But how did you engage with Lucia's White Utopias book? I was wondering how relevant it was for the groups you observed. I don't know those
Yes.
groups, so I can tell myself. But I'd be really, and her thing about, White Utopias being wonderful, within their bubble, as it were, but perhaps needing to engage more widely with the wider world. I was just wondering any ideas you had about that.
Yeah, thank you. So Amanda was on my my dissertation committee, so I had to use her book. But of course, I like her book. I teach her book, and it's really great to meet you, Elizabeth de Michaelis. If I may call you Elizabeth, it's really nice to meet you, an honor. So I did engage her work. I cited it in the book, in particular places where I think it really spoke to what was going on in my field sites. So at times I say, this very much is characterized by what Lucia would describe as a white utopia. In Hawaii, for example, these are definitely the first two chapters, the one with Garani Anjali and then the one in Hawaii, could be framed, and I explicitly do in various places frame them as white utopias to kind of capture them under the banner of people trying to do a both and. They're having a transformation, but this transformation is very white and very situationally located in these particular field sites. So I definitely am also in great debt to Amanda as well, and her work. And I'm glad you actually brought that up. If anybody wants a review or copy of my book, you can reach out to me personally and I'll get one to you. So it's available. Yeah. So thank you for reading the introduction to the book, and look forward to hearing what anyone else has to say about it.